What is up, guys? Top Tier Yu-Gi-Oh here, and today I've got my Tearlaments deck profile from YCS Richmond, and while I didn't top, I do think that the deck performed pretty well. It's just that a couple of misplays, coupled with the natural variance that Tearlaments introduce into your tournament experience, that it ultimately led to an unfavorable result. But I do think the deck was built well. I think the theory was strong, which is why I want to share it with you guys. And so let's go ahead and get into the list. Starting with the Tearlaments monsters, we have 3 copies of Rhinoheart, 3 copies of Diviner, which I know isn't a Tearlaments monster, but it might as well be. And then again, I am okay with these 6 normal summons because despite having, 6 normal summons, the chance of drawing multiples is relatively low, and I think it's more important to draw at least one of your starter cards, coupled with the fact that they are all really good to mill. Like, milling either one of these is strong. Like, Rhinoheart obviously has the graveyard effect, and milling Diviner allows you to bring it back with Cross Sheep and trigger the effect that way. So I definitely wanted to max out on both of them in this kind of build. Next, we have 3 copies of Tier Cash, and then 1 copy of each of the tier monsters that can actually fuse. And then for the Shizu cards, we have 1 Nagito, 1 Kelbeck, 1 Keldo, and 1 Mudora, all pretty standard. And then for the non-engine, we have 3 copies of Kashtira Fenrir. I have to keep moving stuff from here to here because the glare right here is so bad. Sorry about that. Next, we have 3 copies of Danger Nessie and then 1 Danger Jackalope. Once again, I like Jackalope over Mothman because Mothman gives both players a chance to draw and discard, and I do not want my opponent drawing cards, not this format. And while this card can be helpful sometimes, you can trigger your Tearlaments cards, you can also trigger, or not trigger, but send your spells, traps, and Trivy Karmas to the graveyard. I just ultimately don't think it's worth helping your opponent fix their hand, but also the fact that Mothman's discard effect doesn't put a monster on board, whereas any of these will put a monster on board. And in a simplified game state, a single Nessie in hand equals another Nessie on the board because you activate the effect, it gets discarded, and then eventually you get the Jackalope, and then Jackalope summons another Nessie, and then you've got a body on board. And having those extra bodies on board can help you summon an SP or any of your other link monsters that help you sort of break or make your own boards. And so I do like having a guaranteed summon out of my Danger Engine. And then next we have 2 copies of Phantasme, and then 2 copies of Gameciel. I really like this ratio of non-engine cards because it allows me to fill multiple roles. And so for example, we have 7 cards that are really good going second. We have the Fenrirs, the Kaijus, and the Phantasme. Phantasme especially is actually really strong in this format. There's so much targeting right now. There's so many link monsters. SP is everywhere, and this card almost single-handedly deals with that, and it's really good against the Rescue Ace board in particular. And then, so we have going second cards. We also have 5 Aquas for Kaleido Heart. Then we have 3 Darks for Mud Dragon, and then we also have 3 Dark Aquas for Garura. So we can really cover multiple roles like this. And ultimately, it leads to our mills being really strong because everything has value in the grave. Like, even Fenrir is valuable in the grave because you can banish it to summon Tier Cash. So it's almost like every single card, at least every single monster in this deck is good either to be drawn or to be milled. Now, something I would consider moving forward, potentially, I definitely want to test it, is the Horus build. So being able to see it up close, I really realize it's quite strong. Imseti is a very good starter because Imseti on its own will, 1, get you to the Sarcophagus plus another draw, but also it guarantees a zombie vampire, which also then guarantees 2 monsters on board, which means that you can get to either like IP or Cross Sheep for sure, while also giving you to mill 4, which makes it a better starter than Rhinoheart at least. And then being a Xyz monster, if you do go into SP, you're going to get the full effect. Imseti being dark gets you to Mud Dragon, that's good. Like, it's just overall a pretty strong engine. And then depending on the matchup, the summon from graveyard can be quite disruptive as well. And so I am interested in testing out this Horus build moving forward, but I think this build was fine without it for sure. So I think you have options. Like, if you want to play the deck like this, you can. And if you want to drop more money on Imsetis and the Horus option, you could do that as well. I think both are completely viable. It's not like one is clearly stronger than the other or anything. Both are good. Now moving on to the spells and traps. We've got 3 copies of Planet, the 4th copy of Planet, 3 copies of Scream, which I do think is mandatory because it's so good going first or going second. Going first being able to help you set up your boards on your turn and your opponent's, and then going second, it helps you sort of chain block your own effects to keep your opponent from negating them. So I do think Scream is actually insane, and the 500 attack reduction comes up a lot too. 2 copies of Sulliek, 1 Meta Noise, and then finally the 1 copy of Trivy Karma. And for the non-engine spells and traps, I've got 1 copy of Foolish Burial, 1 copy of Foolish Burial Goods, and then the 41st card in this deck, something that I really liked a lot, I've got 1 copy of Instant Fusion. Instant Fusion was insane because it allows you to summon Mud Dragon at any point within your combos. And that makes getting to Bahamut Shark and Toad really easy, but also just being able to protect your plays going first. And so there are a lot of hands to where like sometimes a single imperm on like your Rhino Heart would completely stop your turn. But summoning the Mud Dragon first with the Instant Fusion allows you to sort of bypass that. So, or even like on a Diviner. So it's like you'd Instant Fusion for the Mud Dragon, change its type to Light, summon Diviner. Now your opponent can't imperm or Valor the Diviner. And then Diviner gets to resolve, they get you to a Guido, you mill 5, and you just start kind of rolling from there. And then afterwards, you can just go into a Baron if you want. Depending, like maybe you just miss and mill terribly, or you mill great and just go into like Baron, Bahamut Shark, Toad. Like just, it's crazy. It's a really cool interaction. And then going second against like Rescue Ace, it's really useful against their traps because both contain an extinguishable target. Every time I drew it, I felt very confident playing through a board, and then if I drew it going first, I felt confident making a board. So overall, I do think that Instant Fusion is a great card to include moving forward. I don't see it in very many lists, but I think it's definitely worth trying out for yourself. But that is it for the main deck. The only last thing I want to mention is that I see a lot of people playing Shyama so that you can like mill it and then destroy like your Trivy Karma or your traps with it. But I think that is quite terrible to have a unsearchable 1-of in your deck that is best used when you draw your other unsearchable 1-ofs to then set and be destroyed. I think that just, I don't know, people play it, but it seems like just bad deck building. And I could see more credence going to the D-Hero package because that at least guarantees you get to a Beatrice, which is really good. But just simply destroying like a Trivy Karma or a spell or a trap doesn't do enough, especially when depending on the rest of your mills, it might not do anything at all. So let's say you mill a Scream, but then you also mill Shyama and have Scream on board. Are you going to destroy your Scream, like that won't get its effect, just to get your level 6 Shyama on board? Maybe not. Let's say you mill a Sulliek and then also draw a Sulliek. Are you going to destroy the Sulliek that you've already triggered to again just get a Shyama on board? No, that seems kind of bad. So there are a lot of situations to where Shyama isn't good to either draw or mill, which makes it seem like it maybe shouldn't be played. But let me know what you guys think about Shyama. Hey, maybe I'm wrong. I think one of the lists that topped played it and I didn't top, so maybe they're right. But as always in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can't be too results oriented. You've got to sort of have your own theory, especially not in a deck like this. And then moving on to the extra deck, in order of importance by card type, we've got Kaleido, which is obviously the most important card in the extra deck. It's absolutely critical for you to play around Nib, as well as to just have disruption on both players' turns. And it's also huge, and just generally difficult for your opponents to get off the board. I do want to go up to a second copy though, because the more I played and the more I tested, I kind of realized this closer and closer to the event, is that with SP in the format being able to banish from like both field or graveyard, it makes it to where if the Kaleido that you summon doesn't win the game, you're going to lose it to SP probably, and that makes it very hard to continue forward because your other fusions are generally pretty weak, especially as you get to the mid to late game. So I do think a second copy might be worth it, and it honestly just comes up a lot. But one Kaleido Heart, then we've got one Mud Dragon, which was maybe the definitely the second best fusion in the deck, obviously by, I mentioned with the Instant Fusion. It comes up so much when just playing in the boards. It makes your opponent have to really think about how they interact with your boards, especially because it can change types. Like you naturally do have waters anyway, like your Tear Cash and your Rhino Heart, but then you can change it. So you can have this as water, summon Tear Cash, Rhino Heart, they can't be targeted. Then know you're going to summon something else, change the type, and then summon your other cards safely. So it's really dynamic in how it protects your cards too. Then we've got the one copy of Garura, just generally pretty strong. The other thing of note is that Garura is dark, so sometimes it helps you get into the Mud Dragon depending on how you sequence your plays. And then we have the copy of Draco's Tapelia, which can actually shuffle both of these back into the extra deck, and then this is dark, and so summoning Mud Dragon can shuffle this back into the extra deck, and so it allows you to fuse kind of infinitely actually. The only thing that you can't recycle this way is Kaleido Heart because it can't be used as fusion material, which again is why the second copy would be useful at times. But Draco's Tapelia is also pretty strong. Like just having another form of effect negation just comes up. And then the other thing that people forget is that the monster becomes level 1, and so that can help disrupt some plays as well. So even if you don't want to negate something, the level modulation is also quite useful with a couple of different Synchro and Xyz decks in the format. Now moving on to the Xyz monsters, we have one copy of Totally Awesome, which is incredible, and people don't often think about how useful this is to the engine, the effect to get back a water monster. So you can get back a Rhino Heart, a Tear Cash, depending on the board state, it's actually really good. And it's also Aqua, which means that you can use it for your Kaleido Heart. So you can shuffle it back into the extra deck and keep summoning it back out. And so what happens sometimes is like you'll use Toad effect to shuffle Bahamut back into the extra deck, and then you'll make Kaleido Heart with the Toad, and so on your next turn you've got Bahamut and Toad again. Or you can of course just use like your shufflers to shuffle them back, but they're usually better things to shuffle. But Toad is actually incredible. It's really hard, and there are so many games to where your opponent, they can't use their board breakers the way they would like. For example, if they have a triple tactics talents, they can't, or a thrust, they can't just use that into the board, you know, knowing there's a Toad on the field, because I'll just negate and take it. Like, there are so many talents that I took that I could use in the next turn. Like, it's kind of crazy. But then next we've got Beatrice, which obviously is really strong in this deck. Even if you're not playing the Malicious build or Shyama, it's very easy to go into because we can summon Garura so easily, and we have such easy access to Diviner because, again, we're playing 3. So we've got the 3 Diviners, and we've got a bunch of Dark Aquas, 3 Dark Aquas that we can use to go into Garura. It makes summoning Beatrice pretty consistent, to be honest, even without playing those other bricks. And so I'm pretty happy with Beatrice, went into it a lot, and it also helps you play around Nib. And while it doesn't negate Nib, it creates a game state to where your opponent maybe doesn't want to Nib, because you could just chain the effect, send something else. And so the way this deck plays around Nib, which a lot of people think is impossible because you're not playing Rukalos or Grapha, but you can still play around Nib very, very well. Like, I'm not afraid of Nib at all. And even though you have negations like Toad or Baron, which you could use to negate the Nib, you can also play around it by creating game state to where your opponent doesn't want to Nib you. So you could have like a Beatrice on board to where if your opponent Nibs you, you can just chain the effect, send something else to the grave, and at the resolution fuse for like a Kaleido and shuffle away the Nib again. So then you've got a big token and a Kaleido Heart, and they've got nothing. Or you could summon Kaleido Heart pretty early to where if it gets nibbed, because it's sent to the grave by a card effect, it triggers the effect in grave. So it revives itself, sends another tier card, and so again you end on Kaleido Heart plus another fusion, which probably would be like a Draco's Depalia or something. Something else you could do is set up a Garura. So you get nibbed, and then you get a draw plus whatever other effects you have. So you can create these game states to where even if your opponent nibs you, it doesn't really hurt you that bad. You trigger multiple effects, and then you still end up plussing from it. And so nib's not a problem for this deck at all. And then another card we can use to negate nib, especially when going second if we think the opponent has it, is what do we call this card now? Sky Crisis, Star Slayer, Typhon? I don't know what we call this anymore, or yet. But this card was actually really good. I definitely underestimated it in previous videos. I think I mentioned that it was kind of overrated, but now I think it's actually really strong because there were so many game states, simplified game states at least, to where it was incredibly good for stopping cards like Nib, for making my opponent unable to use their Barons. It was just very strong in general. The bounce is good, and the fact that you can just slap it on a board going second is kind of crazy. The only downside of it is that it doesn't interact very well with Kaleido Heart, because you're not able to activate Kaleido Heart under it. If you've got a Pearlarino on board, your Draco's Depalia is boosted to 32, so that can't use its effect either. So it is something that you have to keep in mind. Something that I did in a couple of games actually was when going second, I would break my opponent's board and then end on like Typhon plus IP. And then if I felt that I needed to go into Kaleido, like the way I would sequence my interruptions is I would IP with the Typhon, go into SP, use SP, maybe use SP's other effect, and then go into Kaleido, or then use my Draco's Depalia. So it doesn't stop you as much as it seems. You just have to sequence your interruptions in a way that allows you to kind of maximize what it does. But it is really good, and it is good into very interesting board states. Like, it's tough for me to say specific scenarios that it's good. It just comes up. I don't know. But then the final Xyz that I played is one copy of Redoer, which is maybe something that I could see cutting for the second Kaleido, and I think I mentioned that in the previous profile. And it's something that I talked about with a lot of people at the event, a lot of other tier players, but Redoer doesn't really come up that often. It only comes up if you've got like a weird Sharon Rhinoheart hand, in which case your hand's already weak. It probably, you maybe don't win that game anyways, and maybe having the extra other card like the Kaleido or something else that you might be thinking about could be better. So it's tricky. And then there are also game states where you leave the Sharon on board, because again, your opponent's not going to nib into your Sharon, it's going to trigger the effect. Or you might have like a Celiac set to where like you negate a card, destroy the Sharon, and then trigger Sharon's fusion effect. So there are game states where again you leave the Sharon on board and you don't want to go into a Redoer. because if you went into Redoer, then you wouldn't have a live Sulliek or Meta Noise. So interesting card. It's good, but also maybe not worth the spot. Then for the Link monsters, you've already seen the IP and the SP. These are both really good. SP is insane, going first or going second. I definitely went into this the most of all the Link monsters. After that, it was like Cross Sheep and IP. They're both really good. Cross Sheep especially is really strong, again, going first or going second. So it kind of makes it difficult sometimes to decide which one you want to do. It's like IP will get you to SP, which is really good. Cross Sheep, sometimes if a Rhino Heart to your grave, guarantees you a fusion. Or there are hands where you make both, and that actually happens pretty frequently. Then next I had one copy of Dark. This was very strong, and then one copy of Underworld Goddess, because I wanted an out to cards that couldn't be like targeted, destroyed, like towers type monsters, or just big monsters, because I realized that there are certain game states where you just can't get over stuff because your entire extra deck is relatively weak. Like your biggest cards are maybe Kaleido and Dracostapelia if you have like a Perlerino, but if you don't have access to them, like if you just milled weird and you don't have enough aquas, or you can't fuse into the Stapelia, it's really hard to get over stuff sometimes. But and your opponent can obviously play around at SP, or maybe you've already used the effect, but Underworld Goddess is something to where you can just put bodies on board and then just take away your opponent's card. And then also the negating cards on the field is useful. It just does a lot of stuff. The graveyard, not protection, but stopping your opponent from summoning from graveyard is pretty good. Like especially against like, your opponent has a rescue set, or you're playing against Unchained. So it comes up in weird scenarios. I kind of like it, but it's also obviously a cuttable card along with the Redoer. I think it's definitely questionable. And then the last card in the extra deck is one copy of Baron, which is just insane. A lot of people sleep on the standby phase Baron effect, but it comes up a lot in this deck, especially again with the 3 copies of Diviner, 3 copies of Rhino Heart. If you use the negate on your turn, on your opponent's turn, you just send it back to the extra deck, summon back one of your starters, mill some more, and then can go into one of your other disruptions sometimes. And then finally for the side deck, which I think was the most questionable part of this list, starting off with 3 copies of Droll. This was really good actually. Droll was insane. 3 Bestials, 2 copies of Druid Swarm, and 1 Magnamut. I was playing these in the main deck for a while instead of the Phantasmes and the Kaijus, but ultimately I felt that I couldn't have these in the main deck in this format that's so diverse, especially with Rescue Ace being kind of the top deck. Like I didn't want to go into an event with Druid Swarm in my deck and end up playing a bunch of Rescue Ace, albeit I didn't play any Rescue Ace, or really not that many decks it's good against anyways. I played like 6 different decks, which is insane. No Rescue Aces. But I do think that it was a good inclusion into the deck. Then I've got 3 copies of Super Poly, insane card, the 3rd copy of Phantasme, and the 3rd copy of the Kaiju. The idea behind having 3 Phantasmes somewhere in the list was that against the decks it's good against, it helps you get multiple draws into the cards that would help you ultimately break their board. So like drawing into the Super Polys or the Bestials or the Drolls, really useful. And then also just being a dark monster is, good, protecting yourself from targeting. It's just a good card overall. It came up in a lot of matchups. And then the final monster that I played was 1 copy of Volcanic Scattershot, which I think you just need a way to play in time. Like it comes up to where you just have to. I got cowboyed in time. Like it just happens. You need something to do in time, otherwise you're just going to lose games, especially in this format because it's so diverse. And so your matches tend to run long. You're gonna have a couple of long ones because you're gonna play some random Marincess deck or generators, and you're not gonna know what their cards do, so you're going to read them, or you're gonna play against the opponent who didn't prepare enough for tier, and they're gonna have to read your cards. And naturally with tier, you have multiple chain links, you have a lot to think about, a lot going on. It's easy to have long matches, and so you have to be prepared for that. So I do think that Scattershot or some type of way to play in time is necessary. It could be Scattershot, could be Cowboy. We do make rank 4s, but I like the Scattershot quite a bit. Something that is relevant to note is that Cowboy is 800, Scattershot is 500, and so Scattershot isn't once per turn though, and so if you do get Cowboyed and you want to sort of beat that with Scattershot, you would have to send it once with Beatrice, and then you would have to send it again off of maybe like a mill or with a Sprint, which I actually side. And so this was another card that simply didn't come up enough in testing, so I decided to move it to the side deck because one situation where it does definitely come up is against, or it comes up in time. Or there are some boards that I make that Sprint is good. So like I cited 3 extra deck cards. I cited the Baguska and the Dweller, because again, all of these only come up in very specific scenarios. And so I would side in the Dweller against Unchained or Tier. I would side in Baguska against combo decks, because I felt that regardless of the boards I can make, and this deck can make some incredible boards, if I wasn't like 100% making the best board possible, like Sulliek, Metanoise, Beatrice, Toad, IP into SP plus Baron, like a deck like Manadium or Infernoble could maybe sometimes break that board. So I really wanted like a floodgate that I could summon against them. And I found that Baguska, Sulliek, and Sprint is actually a really tough board for them to break, because a lot of times their only out to a Baguska is SP Little Knight. But if you have the Sulliek for SP Little Knight, then no, obviously you need a tier card, so maybe like a tier cash in hand, or like you leave a random tier on board. That's really strong. And then you have the Sprint bounce, which also comes up if they really try to overwhelm you. And so I did like that board a lot. And then same with the Dweller. Like Sprint is really good in these boards, but it's not good like if I'm gonna end, like I'd rather end on Cross Sheep than ending on like a Sprint, or I'd rather end on IP than Sprint, whereas obviously you're not using either of those to go into it. So I felt that Sprint was not good in the game's normal combos, but it's great in the side deck combos. But anyways, guys, that's it for my tier limit deck profile. If you want to see another tier list, check out this video right here. If you want to see some test hands, that'll be in this video here on the right side. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I would really appreciate it, and I will see you guys in the next video.